Thank you guys for coming tonight. And I am here to introduce the first speaker tonight. He is the vice presidential candidate on the Nader Gonzalez 08 ticket. Matt Gonzalez is actually a Texas native, born in McAllen and somewhat raised there via a couple other moves. And he went to law school, he graduated at Stanford, and he got his JD at Stanford, I should say, and he had spent the better part of the 90s as a very successful public defender and trial lawyer in San Francisco, and made quite a name for himself. He ran as the district attorney candidate there in '99, I believe, and made a lot of headway. He was running, I believe, as a Democrat. It's unlike here, we don't run under the parties in that sense, but he saw the kind of the automatic benefits of being one of the two major party candidates during the course of that election. Although he didn't win, he gained a lot of ground for his next run and was able to then win a spot on the Board of Supervisors, which is much like our city council. And he was the first Green Party candidate that did get to sit on the Board of Supervisors. He later then became president of the board, which isn't mayor, because later he ran as mayor. The president's much like, from what I understand, sort of a Speaker of the House situation, or mayor pro tem like we have here in Austin. And so that was rather a significant gain for somebody from a third party. I want to present to you the vice presidential candidate for the Nader Gonzalez 08 ticket, Matt Gonzalez.
Thank you very much. So, I've almost lived in this town a couple of times in my life, so it's kind of a treat to be here. And have some friends hidden away here somewhere. I got a call from Ralph Nader saying, "What do you think? You want to do this with me?" And it's a difficult phone call in a way, because there's a lot at stake, and there are a lot of issues that matter to us. And he and I have gotten to know one another in the last decade doing politics. I was doing politics in California. We did a tour of California together talking, anti-war stuff, and I would get into hour-long conversations with him dealing with ballot access disputes. And in that process, we got to know one another. I think I know where he's coming from and vice versa. And there are issues that we care about that we don't think are being addressed by the other candidates. And so then the question that comes up for us is whether or not we just not raise those issues. Do we just say, well, this is just utopian stuff? Do we just set them aside? Do we just ignore them? Barack Obama likes to say superheroes don't get elected president. And he uses that to explain why he can vote poorly over and over again as a kind of excuse, in my opinion. But, there weren't superheroes in Canada when they passed, single-payer universal health care there. There weren't, the people that voted against the Patriot Act were not superheroes. They were like you and I. They were elected, and they were human beings that took a look at something and said, we don't need a government that has these powers. You don't need to be a superhero to know that voting for FISA is wrong, and that giving telecom companies immunity is the wrong choice. But for Nader and I, we were focused on things like single-payer health care, reforming the Taft-Hartley law, demanding majority elections, trying to get a dialogue around the power of corporations in our society. And it's not just that the corporations are powerful, it's that they spill money into politics and they guarantee bad decision-making by legislators. And of course, we very much want to end the war in Iraq. Now, I think it's amazing that any candidate could come before us and tell us that they represent political change and changing the political culture in Washington and vote for every war appropriation. I mean, it doesn't make sense. You can't vote for all these bad laws. And what are we supposed to think? Just wait till later, till they're elected, and then they get to prove to us who they really are? Okay, I can go with this If it's a winning strategy, what's the problem with it? When Obama was criticized by progressives for his faith-based initiative stuff, did you see how he responded? He taunted progressives. He said, "You have not been listening to me." You know, when he was running for the United States Senate, he said he liked NAFTA and there should be more treaties like it. When he was running for president in Ohio, in Wisconsin, where people don't like NAFTA, and he wanted to criticize Hillary Clinton, he was saying, "I have never supported NAFTA. I've never thought it was good for Americans." Once he's got the nomination, he was just interviewed by Fortune. I'll read you the quote. He was asked specifically, "Hey, you made a lot of promises about getting us out of NAFTA, about invoking the 6-month clause that'll get us out." In June 18th, Fortune magazine, Nina Easton, Washington editor, speaks to him. And she says, "Hey, you called it devastating. You called NAFTA a big mistake." He says, "Well, sometimes during a campaign, the rhetoric gets overheated and complicated." So does that mean you're now reversing your position? And in effect, he said yes. So, you know, you could take any one of these issues and demand that politicians have a greater level of discourse with you. Do you realize that we subsidize American corn to the tune of $11 billion a year? So we are engaging in protectionism when we say NAFTA's free trade. Then we go and we dump that corn in Mexican markets. Mexican agricultural workers can't compete, not because they don't grow corn at a better price, they do, but they can't beat $11 billion worth of subsidies. And then when we displace what is in effect 20% of their economy and push those workers to migrate to the urban centers, which are being populated, population increases of 40%, and other workers, 1.3, 1.5 million workers coming to the United States looking for jobs. The public policy discourse we have is, how big should the fence be? Should we give driver's licenses to illegals? But there's no admission on our part that the fiction of free trade is just that. I'm from San Francisco, and Nancy Pelosi told us that she was going to get us out of the war if we made her the speaker. But let me tell you in real numbers what she has brought for us. 2006, so before she was speaker, there were $116 billion going to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. 116. The year she's speaker, 2007, it goes up to 165. In effect, $50 billion more dollars. This year, in multiple appropriations, it's gone up to 189. Another, 20-something billion dollars. This was the political party that if they could just get the speakership would end the war. Remember that? But I guess we're supposed to just forget about that and go along with the leadership. Do you remember what John Murta and all these other people were saying when they introduced those appropriations? Oh, we're doing this now because we want to get it out of the way. What are you trying to get it out of the way of? Out of the way of it being discussed in an American presidential contest? If voting for politicians that tell you political change is voting for these bad laws was working, then I would say, fine, let's do it. It's not working. It's not a winning strategy. It's putting us back, and it's placing us in a position where we now have what we believe is a progressive presidential candidate saying that we are engaging in post-partisan politics. Excuse me? Post-partisan politics? That means I'm allowed to vote bad, but I'm going to justify it by telling you that I don't want there to be arguments in politics. We all have to get together, and if getting together is me voting badly, then that's post-partisan politics. And that's what, in effect, that's the crossroads that we're at. Now, a lot of people, and I understand this, say, hey, listen, I like what you guys represent, I like what you're trying to do, but, there's a contest between two candidates, And if I vote outside of those two candidates, I'm throwing my vote away. Okay, I respect that. Let's talk about it. I like to remind people of a couple of sort of radical political efforts in our nation's history. I mean, when Eugene Debs would walk into a room of men, because only men could vote back then, and he told them that women should have the right to vote, 5 out of 100 men would agree with him, if not less. That's the vote totals he got when he ran 4 or 5 times for president, 5%. So for the men in the audience, if you had lived in Eugene Debs' time, would you have been one of those 5%? Or would you have been saying, I'm not going to throw my vote away. I've got to vote for these other candidates that are talking about more pressing issues. Or if you had lived in the 1840s when the Liberty Party was active and James Birney ran for president on 2 occasions, he got 1% of the vote. He thought slavery should end. He was an abolitionist. 1% of the vote. 20 years later, we have an American Civil War about this. So if you had lived in that time, would you have thrown your vote away? I certainly hope that I would have. The problem with how we do presidential politics in this country, presidential elections, is that it's not an accident that thinking people are confronted with the reality that they might be asked to throw their vote away. If you think about it, the Democratic Party is coming to you and they're saying, I don't like what happened in 2000, you don't like what happened in 2000, you can't let that happen again. Let me see if I get this right though. This is one of the major political organizations to ever exist in the world. And their solution to what happened in 2000, 8 years later, they've done no legislation to fix it. What have they done? They count on the ability to come scare you from voting for candidates that you believe in. And they want you to attack candidates that you should be so happy are out there representing your values, that you should embrace as, part of the family that are fighting for rights and trying to make this a better democracy. Can you imagine how sophisticated this political party is, that they've got so many people buying into that you're supposed to be angry at me and Ralph, that we're even think that we're allowed to campaign and talk about issues, even though we don't agree with the other candidates, right? In a democracy, that's the way it's supposed to be. If you have different views, you ought to be allowed to run. Now, it's astounding to me that anybody would fall for it. 8 years, no legislative activity, but they're going to scare you away from us. Okay. But when they talk about Ralph Nader, do they ever talk about Ross Perot? Ross Perot got 19% of the vote in 1992. Bill Clinton gets elected president with 43% of the vote. 43. That's less a percentage that Bush got in 2000. How many times did you hear the Republicans cry about Ross Perot while Bill Clinton was president of the United States? Right? But it goes back, you go back 100 years to the last 24 presidential contests, a third of them, the winner didn't have a majority of the vote. And usually it benefits the Democrats. Woodrow Wilson, Truman, Kennedy, Clinton twice. Woodrow Wilson, this is a great example. This is 1912. Woodrow Wilson gets under 42% of the vote to become president of the United States, Democrat. Why? Because a former Republican president, Roosevelt, ran against the incumbent Republican president, Taft, and split the vote. Now, why would any political party not want to fix this? Because the people in this room, we could spend 20 minutes max caucusing and coming up with a variety of different ways to fix this problem. So why is it that it hasn't been fixed when it's been happening for 100 years? Right? It doesn't happen because the two major parties would rather arbitrarily lose the presidential contest than open up presidential contests so that we could have a real diversity of opinion. right? If that happened, the things we would be allowed to talk about and implement would just change radically. And that's the problem that we confront. When you attack us, when you refuse to vote for us, when you're scared to vote for us, you are in effect rewarding that political thinking and that political strategy. You're letting them win, and you're letting them sit on their hands and act as if they've implemented reform. Now, I wrote an opinion editorial when I got into the contest with Ralph for the San Francisco Chronicle. Now, when I got into the contest, they made fun of me. They made fun of Ralph for picking me. It's a Democratic town. It's a Democratic newspaper. Now, mind you, as a legislator, I had worked on bringing the highest minimum wage anywhere in the country to San Francisco. We had an indicator for cost of living, so it goes up on its own. You don't ask labor to come back begging every time they need an increase. I had fought for things like fighting against corporate naming rights of publicly built stadiums and things like that. Fought on a lot of good things, but they wouldn't mention any of that when I got into the contest. So I called them up and I said, guys, that wasn't very fair, and they laughed. One of the editors just laughed openly. She couldn't even hold her laughter because she knew what I was talking about. And I said, listen, I have this opinion editorial. The LA Times is thinking about running it, but they want me to change it, and I'll offer it to you guys. They couldn't believe I was even talking to them. But the piece is called What's Good for the Goose is Good for the Gander. And in it, I pointed out that the Democrats often win because of spoiling. And 4 United States senators that are serving right now hold their positions in the US Senate because they were conservative, libertarian, and natural law party candidates that spoiled the contest for Republicans. Harry Reid, the leader in fact, 1998, he wins his contest in Nevada with 428 votes. The Libertarian got 8,000 votes. The Natural Law Party got 2,700 votes. Maria Cantwell in Washington, she wins with 2,200 votes in 2000. Libertarian got 65,000 votes. Tim Johnson wins by a little over 500 votes. The Libertarian has over 3,000 votes. John Tester in Montana wins with 3,500 votes. The Libertarian had 10,000. Do you see? It's not just one political contest. Now in San Francisco, we instituted a type of voting that fixes all this. You go to the ballot and you rank your choices, first, second, third. In the presidential contest in 2000, you would have voted for Ralph Nader first and whoever you wanted second and third. If any candidate doesn't have a majority of the vote, you just get rid of the bottom vote getter and you look at all those ballots, second choices. And you keep doing that until someone's got a majority of the vote. It's elected the mayor of London. It's used in countless races in Australia. It elected the president of Ireland. I mean, this is the 21st century, right? We don't have to be electing a president with less than a majority, and we certainly don't have to be electing a president that got less votes than one of the other candidates. Now, there are a lot of people that want to believe that Senator Obama is moving to the right simply because he's got the nomination now, and now he's got to be elected, et cetera, et cetera. He's not moving to the right. When I got into this contest, I wrote a piece that's easy to find online. It's called The Obama Craze, Count Me Out. And in it, I said, listen, I'm just like everybody else. I'm excited at the prospects that an African-American could be elected president of this country. But you know what? I worked with an African-American mayor, Willie Brown, whose policies hurt African-Americans in our city and displaced, literally hundreds of them during his tenure. And I've seen what Clarence Thomas has done on the U.S. Supreme Court, and I've seen what Colin Powell did for us. We cannot simply reduce race and say we want that so badly that we're going to ignore a voting record. And when I started looking at Obama's record, I found something very conservative and dangerous. And I said so. And a lot of people were upset. And I never thought that during this contest I would get to say, I told you so. I thought it would at least be after he won the contest, but he has surprised me even. He voted for something called the Republican Class Action Reform Law, which makes it harder to bring class action lawsuits in the state courts. A lot of the wage and hour cases that went up against Walmart were not successful in federal court. They worked in state court. So why would he be breaking ranks with John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, and other Democratic senators to vote with the Republicans? He supports limiting pain and suffering damages in medical malpractice cases. He supported that in Illinois when he was in the legislature. He supports that in Congress. What does that mean? The way it's normally cast is he is interested in capping non-economic damages. This is lawyer speak. What it means is this: if you and I have the same injury, we have economic damages, we have non-economic damages. The non-economic damages that he wants to cap are pain and suffering, what we went through, and let a jury decide the amount of money that we should get. The economic damages then would dictate what that injury, the exact same injury to us, would be worth. If I make more money than you, then I get more damages than you, because we calculate economic damages based on the impact it has on our ability to work and things like that. It's a very ugly thing to be engaged in, where you're in effect saying the poorer you are, the less likely you are to fair redress. He opposed, he voted for something in 2005, the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which gave tax breaks and subsidies to oil companies, much more subsidies than were given for alternative energies and technologies like solar, wind, etc. Now, I was talking to a friend of mine about this. ExxonMobil recently posted the highest profits of any corporation in the history of the world, 40-something billion dollars. But in 2005, when this happened, they had record profits back then. They were making like $35 billion. Let me see if that's right. ExxonMobil, I'm sorry, $36 billion. Royal Dutch Shell, $25 billion. British Petroleum, $22 billion. They had record profits. Why would you give them tax breaks and subsidies when they're making that kind of money? Now, in the mid-90s, when we were trying to encourage these oil companies to go do deep drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, which is risky, which is costly, we were willing to suspend our, in effect, it's a royalty payment, a lease payment of 12 to 16%. That makes sense. They're not making record profits. You're trying to get them to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. You got to work with it. But when they're making record profits, it's nonsensical. And when you want to start talking about a windfall profits tax and all of that stuff, what are we going to get out of it? The consumer gets nothing, and we're going to collect back the subsidy we already gave to them. And it's that kind of thing. How are you going to change the culture of Washington when this is who you are? Not who you are a year ago, but who you are over and over again. Opposing gay marriage, supporting the death penalty, voting for the Patriot Act, as I said. Now, one of the ones that I'll mention is really just a classic case of what's wrong with Washington. It's this old Mining Act, I think, of 1872. There was a law that took effect when Ulysses Grant was president, which was a prospector law. I mean, it was like for the individual guy with the pickaxe on his shoulder who would go out and he would rent an acre of land for $2.50, maybe up to $5 an acre, and any hard rock mineral that he got, silver, gold, copper, whatever, you got to keep. You didn't have to pay the government any royalties whatsoever. Well, that was good in 1870s, but that law is still in effect today. And there are multinational corporations that pay us $2.50 an acre on government land that belongs to us, and that's all they pay, and they strip mine the land, they take the hard rock mineral out, and they leave the property in that condition for us to pay to fix it. Okay? I mean, this is crazy. This is absurd. This is gross. And your candidate, the Democratic nominee running for President of the United States, would not support a reform that was going to require 4% royalties for existing mines and 8% for new mines. Compare those royalties, 4 and 8%, with the royalties that we suspended for deep drilling, which were 12 or 16%. These are low royalty amounts. They're making billions of dollars off of us. And that's the candidate that's going to bring you reform? As you can see, I'm not terribly optimistic of that. And I think that if we're true to ourselves, if we're true to trying to improve this democracy, we have to go beyond the rhetoric. Rhetoric is good. You know, I want to believe it, but when somebody demonstrates to me that it is not the truth, then you cannot keep trying to say to yourself that somehow you know what the truth is, particularly if the candidate enjoys going around, in effect, saying, you're not listening to me. Well, we're listening to the other candidates, and they're not good enough to earn your vote. I respect the right of anyone to vote for Barack Obama, John McCain, anybody else. But I hope that you will respect the right of our supporters to vote for us. And I hope that you respect someone like Ralph Nader, who in his history as an outsider has passed more significant legislation than the other candidates running for President of the United States. This is Ralph Nader.
Thank you, Matt Gonzalez. Now you know why he's our vice presidential candidate. I want to approach our effort from your most personal point of view, and that is that we have to face reality. When we face reality, we sometimes have to admit powerlessness. And if we admit powerlessness about things that are dear to our hearts and minds, 40 years, we have sued government, collaborated with it, studied it, investigated it, we know what we're talking about. Corporations want 3 things out of Washington: lax or zero law enforcement, all kinds of special privileges like tax loopholes and tax shelters and so on, and contracts and grants and leaseholds. They want to control our public lands, and they do, even though we own them, and they hardly pay anything for their mineral exploitation. They want to control our public airways, which we own, and they do, and we're the landlords and they're the tenants, the station, radio and TV station, and they pay no rent. Haven't paid any rent since the 1927 Radio Act to the Federal Communications Commission. They want to control the use of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of government research and development that over the years have been given free to these corporations and have built the biotech, semiconductor, aerospace, a good deal of the pharmaceutical industries, the containerization industries, for which these industries take credit as if it was their own money and not yours that did it. And now increasingly they're militarizing foreign policy, corporatizing universities, commercializing childhood, commercializing religious institutions. There is nothing anymore that's off limits to these corporations. And a country that allows its precious civic values and all their diversity to be overcome by commercial values, commercial instincts, commercial greed, is a country doomed to further and further decline. That certainly is a lesson of history. That's why every major religion in the history of the world urged its adherents not to give too much power to the merchant class, because they're so single-minded, so limitless in its seeking profit and acquisition, that if it collides with any other value system, democratic processes, health, safety, respect for posterity, the environment, clean government, clean elections, open courts, the result is these lose. They're eroded, trampled, replaced, corrupted, weakened. So we know what's going on here. You know, in some areas you can give more details than me and Matt. In other areas we can give more details. That's not the issue anymore. You can get information free off the internet. You don't like what the networks are doing? You don't like what talk radio is doing? You got all kinds of material on the internet. You can listen to Amy Goodman. You can get all kinds of blogs. You can look at the Corporate Crime Reporter website, corporatecrimereporter.org, if you want to really see what a corporate crime wave is going on in this country with almost trivial prosecutorial resources. The issue was encapsulated during the Ming Dynasty in 14th century China by a philosopher who said the following: to know and not to do is not to know. Let me say it once more. To know and not to do is not to know. How much do we know, but we can't change our routines? We're easily intimidated. We rationalize our own futility. We exaggerate what it takes in terms of mobilized citizen action to prevail against craven interest groups and giant companies. And that's the way we go through life for the most part. There's more than 1% of the people in this country who hold up the democracy for us. These are the people who become plaintiffs and sue against injustice. These are the people who show up at city council meetings. These are the people who beg their friends to march against war and march for peace. These are the people who are calling up their friends and urging them to go out and vote, and to vote for someone you believe in. These are the people who will write letters to the editor or op-eds, even though 1 out of 10 get in. Why do we leave it up to 1% of the people? What do we have that's more important to do? You say, sleep. That's important.
Sleep when you die.
Work. It's important. Recreation. It's important. What about civics? What kind of niche does civic engagement have? When I see what's happening to our country by giant corporations who were born in the USA, rose to profit on the back of their underpaid and overcharged workers, went to Washington when they messed up and were bailed out by American taxpayers. When they were abroad and got in trouble, they got a call on the U.S. Marines to help them. And decade after decade of these privileges and immunities by these corporations, what's their message to the American people? We're out of here. Our industries and jobs are out of here. We've rigged these trade agreements so they're pulled down trade agreements. They're secret autocratic systems of governance. They bypass our legislature, our courts, our regulatory agencies, and dump the authority in a tribunal in Geneva, Switzerland. And now that we've rigged it, these multinationals say, we can cut deals with fascist and communist dictators and oligarchs who know where to put their workers and know how to put them in their place. And we can send our industries over there with our intellectual property and with modern capital equipment and have these hard workers sweat it out in horrific conditions and brutal conditions and conditions that send them to jail if they form independent trade unions, to work and produce these products and ship them back here and hope that hallowed communities will buy them. That's what they're saying to our country. Now, are you entitled to take that personally? I am. I take that personally. Because we have a phony kind of patriotism in this country. It's a manipulative, controlling process. You can see it because it's flag waving It's constitutional amendments not to desecrate the flag. It's shipping soldiers into criminal wars where they die and kill in Iraq and elsewhere. And then praising them as heroes as we neglect them when they come back with traumatic diseases and with infectious diseases and with injuries that we don't even fully count because it might upset more Americans against the criminal recidivists who now reside in the White House, Bush and Cheney. Your state should be ashamed of itself. Are we going to take it personally?
Yes.
What does that mean now? Now when I say you, obviously it's not you, because you wouldn't be here if it was you, right? Okay, so you know who I'm talking about. Half of the people are so demoralized and so trying to get through the day, they don't even vote. 2/3 of them don't vote in congressional elections. In the primaries, it's 15, 20%, sometimes 9%. So that's what the franchise is worth. The two parties have gerrymandered districts, you know, Tom DeLay, Texas. They have gerrymandered districts, both parties, depending on who controls the state government, denying voters the right of even a two-party choice. Over 90% of the House of Representatives districts are slam-dunk Republican or Democrat incumbents. That means they're a one-party district. Now, how can you ever even use the word democracy to apply to a one-party district? There is no choice. The incumbent wins, wins, wins. That's what gerrymandering does. Ballot access exclusion, Texas style, makes sure you don't have the choice of Nader Gonzalez or the Green Party or a lot of other parties who want to extend the tradition of third parties, independent candidates, as Matt told you so crisply, to put on the table the issues that the other major parties are ignoring, to put on the table the issues that will not be discussed in the presidential campaign or the senatorial campaign, the issues that, if they're not discussed during the campaign, do you think they're going to be considered by whoever wins of the two parties? If we don't talk about the corporate crime wave that has looted trillions of dollars from investors and savers and pensions and workers, if we don't talk about that as a major issue in the presidential campaign, because McCain doesn't have a proposal here, and he never talks about it, and Obama could never even articulate the words corporate crime. He's getting more money from corporate interests as of June 30 than John McCain has been able to get. Including more money from corporate attorneys. Let me tell you, if you want one yardstick to judge a candidate, ask the question, how much money is that candidate getting from corporate attorneys? The most craven members of our profession, the strategists for corporate power, fraud, greed, crime, the theorists of corporate immunity, like telecom immunity. And he's getting more money from corporate attorneys, by far, than John McCain. And so we look at all these situations and we say, do we have the time for our country? Do we have the time for a real definition of patriotism, which is pursuing justice without which there is no pursuit of happiness? Unless you consider cheap entertainment on television the pursuit of happiness. There is no functional definition of patriotism, even by recognizing that the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag ends with those great words, with liberty and justice for all. Not with liberty and justice for a few, not with liberty and justice for some, with liberty and justice for all. What am I talking about? Our expectation level is the lowest in the entire Western world. It may be the lowest in the world, given our capacity and our solutions on the shelf to turn this country around, and turn it around fast. Housing, public transit, energy, eradicating poverty, getting rid of corporate prisons, changing our penal system, turn it around in terms of universal health care. Turn it around in terms of unleashing solar energy and all its manifestations to replace now and forever the burning of fossil fuels and uranium. Turn it around so that Congress, which has 535 men and women who put their shoes on every day like you and I do, stand for the people. They don't grovel for the corporations. There are only 1,500 corporations, give or take, that are getting their way with the majority of those 535 men and women in Congress, the most powerful branch of our government, the branch that can be turned around the fastest for all the obvious reasons. And we're millions out here. And what are we doing? The older generation with its discretionary time, apart from the 1%. What are we doing? Part of what we're doing is we're absorbed by the result of an oligarchic plutocratic system that doesn't allow universal health care, doesn't allow preventive medicine, doesn't clean up the environment, doesn't provide for a living wage, doesn't provide for an adequate retirement. That takes up a lot of discretionary time. And you have to go on 3-4 buses just to get your destination if you can't afford a car or gasoline. And you have to choose in a pay-or-die healthcare system between food or the price of medicines, or $3,000 bills for a cut finger in a hospital. But there is another discretionary time that provides plenty of time for civic time. And we know that even the busiest of us have that time. And we know it doesn't take more than a few million people organized in each congressional district, 2,000 each congressional district, in a powerful, fully staffed Congress civic lobby to lay out 10 major redirections for our country that are 60, 80, 100 years overdue in energy and healthcare and living wage and fiscal prudence and budgets and dirty elections and so on. Doesn't take that much, as long as the focus is laser-like on those 535 people, which can turn around the federal government. They control the purse, they control powers that the executive and judicial branch would drool over, which is why Bush is stealing it from them. As long as those people represent directions that are supported more passively by a large majority of people, those people have the power. Now, isn't it interesting that so inverted and perverse is our electoral system that the positions of McCain and Obama are not supported by a majority of the people? The non-positions doing nothing on corporate crime are not supported by the American people. But our positions are. You know, you can look at them on the website, one after another. Look at it. Getting out of Iraq, 65 to 70% want out. They want out. They don't want military bases there, 50 to 80,000 troops, Obama style, in 16 months. They don't want us to continue blowing apart that country and creating more resentment, more hatred, more recruiting grounds for young men to learn the skills of violence and sabotage, something that was actually stated by General Casey and former head of the CIA, Porter Goss. They made statements saying our continued military occupation is a recruiting ground and a magnet for more and more terrorists. Well, that's a real smart policy. You pursue terrorists in ways that vastly increase their numbers. What kind of prize should that get? Single-payer, Canadian-style healthcare system with improvements. Now, there's one. Free choice of doctor and hospital, which most people don't have because they're HMO imprisoned. And doctors like it. 59% in a poll in April say they're for single-payer because they want to practice medicine, not bookkeeping. They don't want to have their hands tied along with their nurses by corporatists who make more money by denying claims. Majority of people have favored that for years. Full Medicare. Living wage, here's one. Texas is a disaster. I don't even know if it has a state minimum wage. It's so porous. Here it is, last Thursday, a milestone that the Democrats and Republicans can be proud of. The federal minimum wage rose to $6.55. If the federal minimum wage in 1968 was adjusted for inflation, it would be $10 an hour today. So here we have, the economy has doubled in productivity per worker since 1968. And the minimum wage in purchasing power is $3.45 less than it was in 1968, going backwards into the future. Where is our indignation? You know where it is? Among the poor, it's a luxury. They're just trying to get through the day. They're just trying to meet bills from 6 months ago. But among the contented classes, why should they care? They're way beyond the minimum wage. They're working with technology. They're working with intellectual property. They're working with jobs that pay way more than that. It's only the contented classes, unfortunately, that are going to change things. But only when they become discontented. And why are they contented? Doesn't global warming affect all of them? Don't wars affect? Don't these grotesque tax systems favoring corporations and offshore tax havens? Don't all these things that Matt and I have just described and you know and read about and talk about with your friends, doesn't that all affect you? Of course it does. But you know what the trap is? The trap is the failure to make the distinction between personal freedom and civic freedom. In our country, we have a lot of personal freedom. We can travel where we want, play where we want, date who we want, marry who we want, see whatever movies we want, buy what we want, swear what we want. That's personal freedom. But do we have the civic freedom to do anything about the rumble of war to Iraq? Do we have the civic freedom to turn that Israeli-Palestinian conflict around and have the U.S. government support the Israeli and Palestinian peace movements who've worked out an accord year after year? The most prominent being in the Geneva Accord, instead of supporting the hardline militarists who are oppressing, colonizing the Palestinian people, brutalizing them, stealing their land and their water in the 22% that's left of Palestine? Isn't 78% enough? Haven't the Palestinians conceded 78% of Palestine? Do we have civic freedom to say to Wall Street, you guys are either the worst mismanagement in American economic history, or your greed, your irresponsibility, their immunity to your investors have led you to collapse Merrill Lynch and Citibank and Bank of America and Wachovia and Countrywide and on, and then you go to Washington for a bailout. So you can do it again and again because you're too big to fail. Or shall we say too pig to fail with respect to the animal rights movement. Are we affecting that? Do we have the civic freedom for that? The Roman lawyer over 2,000 years ago, Marcus Cicero, once defined freedom in the best way I've ever heard. He said, freedom is participation in power. Freedom is participation in power. How much freedom do we have by that definition? Local, state, national, international? Whatever happened to the sovereignty of the people? That's civic freedom. Whatever happened to the preamble to our Constitution? We the people, not we the corporation, we the people. And so because we got plenty of personal freedom, we have those great toys, iPods and iTunes, the internet and the blogs, whee! endless creativity, endless modulation. Because we have all this civic freedom, all this personal freedom, we do not focus on the most important freedom of all. What is going to be the quality of personal freedom? For students coming out of universities today, the jobs are being outsourced, white collar, blue collar. Anything that goes through software can be outsourced. That means architectural, engineering, accounting, media, law, you name it. They can't get affordable housing. They can't get affordable health insurance. The student loan rackets kick in to gouge them and fine print them and to twist them and manipulate them, Sally Mae style, which cut a deal with the U.S. government because of its lobbyists, where if it profits, it keeps it, but if the student loan defaults, Uncle Sam makes up the difference. Pretty good. Here they are. Insurance, housing, jobs, student loans, which make them risk averse. One of the reasons why students, after they graduated in the 60s, they didn't have those kinds of student loans. They didn't have to immediately conform, put on their suits. They had a little leeway to ask impertinent questions and engage in marches and rallies. And then what does this 22-year-old do? You know, sits down with some friends, smokes a joint, gets arrested, thrown in jail. Not a cigarette, by the way. Not alcohol. Marijuana, 800,000 arrests. Is this the way we want to fill up our prisons? $30,000 to $50,000 per prisoner per year, increasingly corporate prisons? This is insanity. I once spoke to a large convention of psychologists. It was a National Association of Psychologists. And I said to him, you know, you've made a career out of refining and defining individual mental health problems. And you've defined insanity in individual terms. Have you ever thought of defining collective insanity? Organizational insanity? Corporate insanity? Government insanity? And I gave him some examples. I said, look, you got the Pentagon, who has no measure of limits because Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics and Boeing are pushing more and more through Congress, more and more weapon systems. We now have enough TNT equivalent weapon systems, according to an industrial engineering professor at Columbia, to blow up the world 300 times and make the rubble bounce. One Trident submarine can wipe out 200 cities with multiple warheads in the world. How about the insanity of General Motors, which for 80 years has fought tooth and nail any attempts to toilet train itself and its products? How about the drug companies, who seem to be overcome with irresistible impulses of kleptomania for their customers? And how about those HMOs? What should we accuse them of in psychological terminology? Let's see. Attention deficit disorder. In the hospital now, 24 hours. So, really comes down to what is called the small community. It's a wonderful little book published in 1940. Yes, there was wisdom before email. It's published by the former chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority, who went all over the world trying to figure out why the few who have the power always prevail against the many. And he came to the conclusion that without the formation of intensely personal small communities in the neighborhoods or any other small community venues, democracy does not grow, democracy does not thrive, democracy does not have deep roots. So he writes this book, The Small Community. Now, some of you may think that there are communities on the internet, to some extent they're functional. They tell you what's going on, they retrieve information, they trade ideas, but there's no substitute for intense exchanges with purposeful small communities, such as, for example, citizen lobbies on Congress that take the general interests of the public as their priority. I want to leave you with this thought. And Matt really said it very well. We are political slaves if we fall prey to two corrupt converging parties and feel that we have to vote for one of the parties, no matter how bad that party is, by our judgment, as long as the other party's worse. The moment we are confirmed least worst voters, three things will happen. One, the least worst choice will take our vote for granted and never look back. When the anti-war movement took off in 2004, breaking the great global and national marches against the war of 2003, because they didn't want to embarrass John Kerry, who wanted more soldiers in Iraq, and as he said to Bush on the first debate, we wouldn't have pulled out of Fallujah. Remember that one? You know, after the election, Bush went into Fallujah, 350,000 people. Half of them abandoned it before the invasion, and he blew it apart. He knew he didn't have to worry about the Democrats because, remember, John Kerry said, we wouldn't have pulled out of Fallujah. So your vote gets taken for granted. Number two, the corporations are pulling 24/7 in their direction, and because you're so freaked out at the worst of the least worst, you're not pulling at all in your direction. We canvassed 19 websites of 19 pro-Kerry groups in 2004. The usual: anti-poverty, civil rights, women's rights, gay, lesbian rights, environment, labor, peace, etc. Not one of them was making a demand on Kerry Edwards. Just leave them alone. I mean, don't embarrass them. As if they don't have confidence that if they made a demand on Kerry and said, you will come out for a $10 minimum wage, which is equivalent to what it was in 1968, no big deal, the workers earned it, that it would get more votes. How could they not think it wouldn't get any more votes? How could they think that all these positions that corporations don't like, if the Democrats took them, they wouldn't get more votes? Well, they say, they got to do this. You don't understand, Ralph. They got to do this to get elected. Oh, let's go back through history. Ah, yeah, the opportunistic strategy. Let's see. Walter Mondale. That worked, didn't it? How about Dukakis? Oh, that worked, didn't it? When's it ever worked, except for Ross Perot that made it work with his 19 million? They would have all lost. Actually, the political scientists who studied 2000, if I may interject this personal point of privilege, said that if Nader LeDuc were not in the race, Gore would have gotten fewer votes. Why? Because we pushed him to make more populist statements against the advice of Lieberman, who, if Gore won, and won again in 2004, would be the leading candidate for the Democratic Party. You want to thank me for that one? Excuse me, I made a mistake. AP had a poll right after, without Nader LeDuc, and Bush won. So he really benefited. But you'll never persuade hardline, least worst Democrats that. They don't look at the dynamics before Election Day, which are what produces the result on Election Day. Assuming Gore didn't have his victory stolen from Tallahassee to the Supreme Court in 20 ways by the Republicans. It is not a winning strategy for us to let the least worst party to continue blurring the distinctions, as Obama is doing now by the day, with the Republicans. That is not a winning strategy. The winning strategy is to play hard to get, especially in slam dunk stakes where it's Republican Democrats going to win, like Texas, Republican, Oklahoma, Republican, Massachusetts, Democrat, where you are free, even if you have the hang-up of a least worst voting propensity, to play hard to get, to make demands, and if they're not met, you put your vote in another column. That's what third parties served in the 19th and early 20th century. We always have to keep in mind who says no. And all these changes that I think a lot of you agree with, single payer, HMO, health insurance companies, drug companies say no, American people say yes, the corporations win, American people lose, 18,000 people die every year because they can't afford health care. Is that democracy? No. Living wage? Who says no? McDonald's, Burger King, Kmart, Walmart. The people say yes, corporations win, the people lose. Is that democracy? Whenever you ask, who says no? Who says no to shrinking the military-industrial complex? It's wrecking our budget, keeping hundreds of billions of dollars from rebuilding the public works that pay good jobs that can't be exported. And city after city, schools, libraries, clinics, sewage system upgrades, drinking water upgrades, all these things. Who says it's the military-industrial, it's the Lockheed. It's all those companies we see full-page ads on more weapons of mass destruction at our public service. So that's really what the central core of political campaigning has got to be in this country. The sovereignty of the people must subordinate the power of corporations, which are chartered by government to behave themselves. The government brings them into existence. Investors don't start corporations, they fund them. Corporations are created by state charter. And they were created in the early 1800s to be our servants, not our masters. They're now our masters, astride the world, pitting governments against one another to pull standards down, 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 which is why those trade agreements are written in that way. I'll leave you, before we have a discussion, I want to leave you with this. Nothing we ever ask of you is anything close to what we demand of ourselves. If you think it's easy to confront the political bigotry of well-meaning people who are progressives and liberals and who agree with you on almost all issues, but keep saying, don't you run, drop out, that's not easy. I'm accustomed to corporate lobbyists going up against us. But what kind of system is this 220-year-old political two-party duopoly disgraced by electoral college where you can come in second and become president? What kind of system is it that divides the people outside the electoral arena who agree with us inside the electoral arena and pits them against us, like The Nation magazine or Progressive magazine? There's something crazy about that. In the 19th century, the civic movements against slavery and for women's right to vote and for labor and farmer, on the outside, they supported those little parties. They had perhaps a more astute sense of political leverage. It is not easy to do this, but it has to be done. And it can only be done with enough people who think about what they want their vote to mean. And your vote is not just voting for someone you believe in. Your vote is not only just denying the two parties your vote because you think they both flunked and putting it in a progressive column. What your vote means is you'll strengthen those citizen groups in Washington the more votes Nader Gonzalez gets. Your vote means that you've been liberated from the yoke of this 220-year-old system that forces us to fight each other when we agree on the great directions of our country and its status in the world. And I'll leave you with a comment by Eugene Debs. At the end of his career, I think it was about 1920, he was asked by a reporter, "What is your greatest regret, Mr. Debs?" He said, "My greatest regret?" He said, "My greatest regret is under the Constitution, the American people can have almost anything they want, but it just seems like they don't want much of anything at all." Fast forward, 1945. U.S. emerges from World War II, the most powerful economic and military country in the world. Western Europe, rubble. Rubble, disintegration, disease, economy smashed. But they had a higher level of expectation than we did. From rubble, they demanded through their social democratic parties, their trade unions, their cooperatives, and other institutions, and directly through marches and demonstrations, they demanded by law universal health care, decent pensions, living wage, university free education, decent public transit. They demanded by law paid maternity leave, paid family sick leave. They demanded by law laws that made it easy to form trade unions and co-ops. They demanded and got all this by law. And 60 plus years later, we don't have any of this by law. So much for the lowest expectation levels in the Western world. And it's time to become socially indignant. It's not enough to know if you don't have fire in your belly, to change your daily routine, to develop different kinds of priorities, to tell those young, talented people not to have their talents trivialized by lucratively paid public corporate jobs that are going nowhere in terms of any elevation of the human condition. If we don't begin breaking that routine, it's just going to get worse and worse, as it has been getting worse and worse for the last 25 years, indicator by indicator, for the majority of the American people, including wages. Now, one of the purposes of our campaign is to bring young people into this campaign. We go around the country, we come to people who've made contributions to us. And so we ask them, who are you? One man contributed $4,000 to our campaign in 2004. He said, "I move around food pallets in a food warehouse." I said, "How old are you?" He says, "I'm 32, and that's the only job I'm ever going to have in my life." So how in the world did you contribute $4,000 to the Nader Camejo campaign? And he said, "It was my way of protesting." I just think, what does that do to us in terms of the trust that he has reposited in our campaign? And another man was a 64-year-old Vietnam veteran who had Agent Orange disease. And he sent us $1,300. And I said, "Thank you very much for contributing. That's a sizable sum to us." He said, "I didn't contribute it to you. I'm not giving this to you. I contributed that to me." I said to myself, shades of my father. Because he'd always tell people who were giving to charity or social justice movements, don't think you're giving it to them. This is your public investment. I want to bring up here a young man, Matthew Zawiski, for just a few minutes. It'll be fun, you'll see. And then we'll come back for a discussion. He hails from Buffalo, so he knows what deindustrialization is all about. And there you go, Buffalo here. And he was a citizen activist there. I met him at college when he was graduating in Geneseo, upstate New York. He's been our organizer for 7 years. He's got more antenna than any insect I've ever studied. In terms of anticipating things, a great organizer on the ground. And he's going to say a few words, give you some interesting news, and indicate how you can help us even more than you already have done. Matt?
Thank you, Ralph. As Ralph mentioned, I met Ralph in Buffalo as a young student, and on so many issues, in so many ways. In 2000, during the Nader campaign, he was the only one to come to Buffalo. And in so many ways, he's the only one to lead on so many issues. For instance, in the 70s, he helped us out with Love Canal, a toxic waste dump in Niagara Falls. In West Valley, there's another toxic waste dump down in western New York. And just recently, a plutonium deposit in Niagara County. So this is just one area of the country which he has led and worked with local groups and helped us in so many ways. And I think it's important to think about young people. And myself, we get out of college or high school, and the pressures of just trying to get by just seem even more and more burdensome. Trying to pay for college education, health care, trying to find a decent place to rent, a decent place to live. It's almost like a dream. It's just to buy a bloody house and just to get around and take care of yourself. And what I've seen, I'm sure many of you have seen this, is just classmates and friends just not really able to get involved or not wanting to get involved because they don't want to rock the boat. And thank goodness we have someone like Ralph and Matt Gonzalez who are really willing to join many others on a national scale to really challenge these two parties that really have failed us. And he brings the stamina, the record, the inspiration, the institution building, the humor, and many other things that I think we need in a national debate. And also solutions, deaths on the highways, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which has resulted in millions of lives saved just with a couple very hard-fought battles, which is pretty amazing. Death in the oil wells, the coal mines, OSHA, EPA, Freedom of Information Act. Imagine what our country would look like without these, the Federal Act and these sunshine laws that are throughout the different states. I'm sure you guys know locally here, there's a very successful nonpartisan groups, Public Citizen. How many people have helped, they have an office right here in Austin. So I think it's a real testament that we have Ralph, who could just be sitting in the background, but he's leading in so many ways. So we really need to take heed and support people who are doing this. And think about when else are we going to have someone like Ralph running on a national campaign and during a very urgent time. Just to give you a update on the campaign, we're polling at 5% and 6%, which is extremely exciting because of the press blackout that has come about. And the first two things the press want to know is how much money have you raised, how many state ballots you're on. And as a result of this campaign, there's been hundreds of road trippers and folks, thousands of folks collecting signatures. Many of them, I think 70% are new to politics. And getting these new folks on the ground willing to be rejected, to sweat for these issues, I think is extremely important. As I'm sure you've seen, many people just have given up on themselves and on politics, and thank goodness we have Ralph and others who can give people that confidence again. So, for some of you, just getting here was a stretch, and we've been getting around on a stretch. We just started in Charlotte, and we drove down to Jackson, and flew up to Houston. So the last 3 days, and it's a real grassroots effort, but we want to be taken seriously. I'm sure many of you here want these issues, and we need to invest in these issues. So we're asking if there's one person here who may have means, and if there's one, the most one can give is $4,600. So that's the window. And if you want politics for you, you really have to pay for it and get serious. So we're asking if there's one person here who can get the ball rolling for Ralph and give, say, $2,300 tonight in Austin. Is there one person here who can do that? It's a lot of money.
I'll do it.
Very, very good. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Is there another person, unbeknownst to this gentleman who I've never met, we will feature as a tribute to that donation, Unsafe at Any Speed, 40th anniversary edition, very few around, for $2,300. Can anyone give that? Ralph will sign it, and for $2,300, this gentleman will be the first one. Can anyone else afford that or match that? We'll make it feel real good. There's folks have said, this guy in Raleigh said, there's nothing more liberating than giving Ralph more money that you can afford. So it's, I gotta eat ramen noodles for a month, but it's worth it. So think about it. You know, this is a fantastic opportunity. Anyone else can afford that much or give that much? Is there one more person? Okay. We'll make it a little easier. Let's try. You got one more? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It takes a while to really think about it. So it's you know, think about the budget and stuff. So thank you very much for your generosity. Hey, how about $1,000? A lot easier. And we have, who here has seen Unreasonable Man and Unreasonable Man? I think it's a real, we have a copy here. For anyone who gives $1,000. And for those of you who don't know, it's a documentary about Ralph, a fantastic, it just came out a year and a half ago. It's a fantastic picture and motivator of the public interest movement in the 60s and then on, and why we need to knock on the halls of power through the electoral process as well. Does anyone give $1,000? And this will be your token of appreciation. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you very much. Exactly. We're invited to Google, and have you guys heard about this? We were invited to the Google campus since Ralph is running. They invited us. We came to the Mountain View campus, and they would like to host a presidential debate in New Orleans on September 18th. So, which is my birthday, but imagine that. And the media, they're going to say, we need 10% in the polls, so we really need to build this train to get to that level. So, who here would like to see, Ralph in a debate?